because the operation of Western ports is vital to our economy and to our military. This dispute between management and labor cannot be allowed to further harm the economy. It is hurting truckers and rail operators who carry goods to other parts of America. It's hurting farmers and ranchers and manufacturers, retailers and consumers who make, buy, and sell the products that pass through our ports. I have determined that the current situation imperils our national health and safety. The crisis in our western ports is hurting the economy. It is hurting the security of our country, and the federal government must act.
In that press conference from 2002, Bush informed the viewing public of his hard, militaristic stance in response to the ILWU strikes in the ports of LA and Long Beach. Eventually locked out of the port by the PMA, the Pacific Maritime Association, the striking dockworkers and ILWU negotiators suddenly found themselves in the crosshairs of a joint effort between private corporations and the state to resume operations in the western ports, to restart what was and still continues to be the veritable conveyor belt of the nation's economy. With Bush's invocation of the Taft-Hartley Act, the most notoriously anti-union and anti-communist law that codified right-to-work legislation and disintegrated organized labor movements of the post-war period, an issue that was originally between labor and management suddenly became the prerogative of the state. Moreover, the lockout bought time for the Bush administration to collude with CEOs and business elites from Best Buy, Boeing, Ford, and Dell. Thus, not only was this intervention by the state informed by the military-industrial complex, but was just as much at the behest of private enterprise. Suddenly, the striking dockworkers were no longer just workers with grievances, but were now, in effect, tantamount to foreign enemies of the U.S. state and capitalist class. Very much in the parlance of the post-9/11 political-legal response, it's telling that the Bush administration described the actions of the dockworkers as, quote, economic terrorism. Writing for the World Socialist website in 2002, David Walsh and Ron Jorgensen write, quote, the Bush administration is plotting with the employers to weaken or break the ILWU under the cover of the war on terrorism. Administration officials consider workers' entirely legal efforts to win better wages and conditions as impermissible disruptions of the flow of profits to big business. In fact, it was after mounting pressure and lobbying from the WCW, the West Coast Waterfront Coalition, an organization made up of transnational companies like Walmart, Target, Nike, and IKEA, that the administration finally threatened the dockworkers with draconian military intervention and state-sponsored violence. As Deborah Cohen states in her book, The Daily Life of Logistics, Mapping Violence in Global Trade, quote, the events in LA Long Beach also established that the disruption of supply chains is understood as a matter of national security. This is precisely the logic of supply chain security. Trade disruption has moved from an economic cost to a security threat. The lesson derived from the waterfront in 2002 is that the defenders of the capitalist order will resort to militaristic ruination before agreeing to an even remotely conciliatory compromise. A viable contract was on the table, but the PMA waited for Bush to activate Taft-Hartley. Foremost, however, is that corporate interests, like the PMA, abetted by the US government, weaponized the rhetoric of the war on terror in an attempt to bust, once and for all, this country's arguably strongest union, the ILWU. And in pursuit of what? Partly in pursuit of introducing automation technologies that would only further lubricate the gears of an economy increasingly dependent on just-in-time supply chains while driving down the cost of labor. The U.S. economy, dictated by capitalism's imperative for short-term gain, is simply too dependent on the wealth that it extracts from the global south and developing countries, wealth that is imported back into the imperial core. The vulgar forms of colonial and imperial violence in one century are today achieved by the U.S. empire's use of the World Bank and the IMF developments by which the US military and its presence, if not outright occupation, is justified under the guise of national security. Of course, prefigured by the development of industrial capitalism, this regime of a global economic order, marshaled by private multinationals and state intervention abroad, is of no surprise. As Marx and Engels asserted and foretold in the manifesto, quote, "The need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. It creates a world after its own image." But what is this image, or images? Marx theorized a dialectical relation between the base, the material and economic foundation of society, and the superstructure, the laws, art, politics, and ideas found within that society. The bourgeoisie wouldn't be a ruling class without ruling ideas. As Marx puts it in a preface to the Critique of Political Economy, quote, "The totality of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation on which arises a legal and political superstructure and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the general process of social, political, and intellectual life. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their existence, but their social existence that determines their consciousness." With the technological developments of print, radio, film, television, the internet, the bourgeois class has found over the ages new modalities, new media to broadcast their messaging, usually with an ideological bent, and typically one in favor of perpetuating capitalism. This floods front covers, airwaves, and screens. So while their wealth has yet to trickle down, it is evident that their ideas, representations of their ideas, and their own images have trickled down to the base, inundating us. Just as maritime trade and our global supply chains, as well as the labor of that logistics that keeps the circus of capital in motion, are rendered invisible, media images and representations of these supply chains and that labor are telling in what they make visible and invisible. Here I want to pivot and analyze one example, though it is an example constituted by disparate and fragmented parts. I am referring to the online multiplayer maps of Call of Duty Modern Warfare, a video game that, like Bush's conflation of economic concerns with militaristic ones, illustrates a curious juxtaposition of the commercial supply chain and depictions of militarized imperial violence. Most importantly, these decontextualized images are accompanied by authorial claims to realism and apoliticism that complicate the positioning and orienting of these images within world historical developments of global capitalism and US empire. Therefore, we can construe the realism of these maps as what Lukács might have called pseudo-realism. But what these maps do truthfully demonstrate, however, just as the US state has demonstrated time and time again, Bush's statements from 2002 par excellence, is just how easily transposable sites of commerce, supply, and logistics are into becoming sites of militarized violence, securitized surveillance, and imperial terror. Notably, an element missing from these maps, an element rendered invisible, is labor. The notion of economic terrorism, so assailed by the Bush administration, was and is in part fueled by a bourgeois fantasy of a supply chain devoid of pesky workers. In fact, one of the decisions that the ILWU was striking against was an effort by port authorities to partially automate the ports. As Lele Khalili describes in her book Sinews of War and Trade, quote, "The technopolitics of port management occur at the point of convergence between automation technologies, algorithmic security, supply chain streamlining, and a degree of fantasy. The element of fantasy is present in two areas. First, fantastic monsters of terrorism, violence, and insecurity are conjured as threats to port or terminal security, and equally fantastical solutions are offered, which subject ports and ships to surveillance, security bureaucracies, and useless red tape. The conjurers of these nightmares of terror are often security experts who, along with their cargo of fear, sell their security expertise." In the kind of images and environments a player encounters in the Call of Duty Modern Warfare multiplayer maps, this idea becomes reified. The social relations of the productive forces of society, or of globally interconnected societies, are rendered invisible, while the products of labor, commodities, become fetishized. As Robert Dale Parker, in his Introduction to Marxism and How to Read Literature, puts it, quote, "Amidst commodity fetishism, things take over human life as consumers lose touch with the actual labor of the proletariat that global corporations outsource to a distant, unseen elsewhere." Within the milieu of a Call of Duty map, there are few other objects more emblematic of this than the shipping container, that monument to the logistics revolution that nearly single-handedly reordered the neoliberal world economy, and almost every map features a shipping container. The absence of labor in these maps is striking, nor is there even the ghostly residue of human labor, like dead bodies, casualties from these war-torn conflicts, largely in urban areas and largely portside. With the developers' appeal to realism and apoliticism, Call of Duty conveniently excuses itself from the invidious task of having to realistically depict laboring conditions predominantly in the global south, conditions always to the benefit of the global north and always to the detriment of regional pools of labor. Not only are combatants depicted as brown people who look like stereotypical terrorists, but curiously, the complete purgation of labor seems to suggest which of the two is more of a threat to the status quo and the US capitalist hegemon abroad and at home. With this essay, I want to examine how Call of Duty's ostensible use of realism, or pseudo-realism, becomes a device with which the game's maps make contradictory and somewhat opposing claims. One claim that gestures towards an epistemology of military violence and literally modern warfare, and another claim of exemption from the, as Lukács called it, objective reality of bourgeois political economy, an economy increasingly reliant on the forms of imperial violence and state terror, in fact depicted in Call of Duty. By refusing to reveal and disclose certain aspects, I believe the fragmented experience of playing Call of Duty maps can in fact reveal something about the actual maps and the nature of fragmented labor that finds itself in a neoliberal world order of intensifying capitalist extraction and exploitation. For any claim to apoliticism in a game that depicts the nexus of war and trade in the modern era, that must be in fact itself an inherently political maneuver. As Keller Easterling writes in her book Enduring Innocence, quote, "Worlds and empires shelter and fatten offshore, dropping into protected enclaves, free economic zones, and paper sovereignties long enough to avoid taxes, engage in expensive labor, or launder an identity. Streamlined logistics and loosened legalities are among the bullet-pointed features of every logistics park and free economic zone in the world. These new seas and the boundaries between them are arguably some of the most politicized and conflicted places on Earth, all laying simultaneous claim to oil drilling rights or protective zones of security." At the pinnacle of Dutch dominance over maritime trade throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, the harbor became a focal point for many eminent Dutch painters. Like the ocean itself, the canvas reflected back an era of bustling mercantilism, industrious shipbuilding, and military conflict on the high seas. In her study of Dutch painting of this era, Svetlana Alpers, in her book Art of Describing, asserts that what defined Dutch painting throughout this period was neither allegory nor symbolism, but simply the raw descriptive power of representation. Like their counterparts in the hard sciences, for Alpers, the Dutch painter was, quote, an experimenter in natural knowledge. This visual epistemology, according to Alpers, supplanted the narrative with the document. Technical proficiency, that is, was the hallmark of a tradition concerned with description and realism. To quote Alpers, this understanding allows the viewer to encounter Dutch art anew in terms of, quote, an absence of any learned discourse and no connection with any institution engaged in it, the use of traditional skills, a renewed sense of purpose, and delight in discovery. However, in response, the artist, writer, and filmmaker Alan Sekula reminds us, behind even the most faithful depiction of these Dutch vessels, depictions typically commissioned by, quote, city magistrates or by shareholders in the great trading companies, end quote, convergences of power, exploitation, and violence, to say nothing of slave labor, exists. And while Alpers references Foucault to explicate how Dutch painting was reordered by a new regime of representation, categorization, and taxonomy, Alpers is concerned with the Foucault of the order of things, but not the Foucault of knowledge power. These were, after all, vessels plying the high seas in pursuit of conquest and profit. For Sekula, Alpers is a reductionist view, a reading too surface level. Instead, Sekula believes we can view this descriptive power exercised by these adept painters as a craft in the service of the, quote, allegories of empire. As Sekula writes, quote, one obvious condition of Dutch maritime painting success lay in the ability of the painter to articulate the economic link between the ship and the city in appropriately illusionistic and non-symbolic spatial terms. Of course, this wouldn't be the first time that two critics were at loggerheads over the role of art and realism in the relation to the world, economic paradigms, and the historical development thereof. Most contentious of all might be the series of arguments and subsequent counter-arguments between German Marxist philosopher Ernst Bloch and Hungarian Marxist philosopher Georgi Lukács regarding the literary and visual art movements of expressionism, naturalism, surrealism, and, of course, realism. Perhaps because expressionism limited itself too narrowly to the subjective, it failed to account for what Lukács rightly pointed out as the objective unified totality that stitches together, quote, the economy of the whole world. It doesn't require us being artists or theoreticians to know how integrated the totality of the world economy actually is. For instance, in our protracted time indoors throughout the pandemic, one thing became clear. The means of consumption that much of our lives depend on is itself dependent on the infrastructure, logistics, and labor of global supply chains. Our self-isolations seemed belied by the ceaseless stream of Instacart drop-offs, Amazon packages, and other commodities that arrive at our doorstep. For his part, Lukács acknowledged that this totality was, and is, still determined by historical forces. Quote, economic reality as a totality is itself subject to historical change, Lukács wrote. But that qualification does not and should not supersede one of the central axioms identified by Marx of capitalism. To quote Lukács in full, those historical changes, quote, consist largely in the way in which all the various aspects of the economy are expanded and intensified so that the totality becomes ever more closely knit and substantial. After all, according to Marx, the decisive progressive role of the bourgeoisie in history is to develop the world market. Bloch's contention, on the other hand, was that Lukács' conceptualization of totality was inherently delimiting when it came to the subjective experience. The self-enclosed idealistic system that Lukács theorized for Bloch precluded artists from excavating the ruptures that inevitably surface in society. Bloch views expressionism as, quote, an art which strives to exploit the real fissures and surface interrelations and to discover the new in their crevices. But, in Bloch's opinion, this artistic preoccupation and sensibility, quote, appears in Lukács' eyes merely as a willful act of destruction. He thereby equates experiment and demolition with a condition of decadence. And yet, while Bloch's position is not without merit, for it has been, in fact, those artists who've plumbed the chasms of discontinuity and fragmentation that have indeed generated era-defining art. Yet it has to be recognized as a true testament to the plasticity of capitalism, from base to superstructure, how discontinuity and fragmentation have been wielded to atomize the working class, decouple radical politics from the labor movement, and obfuscate the social relations of production via the culture industry.
And I now have the ranch wagon all to myself. It's a whole new way of life.
And it is at this juncture that we can begin to understand Walter Benjamin's ambivalence and reticence about the advent of film. Reproducibility can be weaponized, as in the case of the fascistic montage, but it can also lend itself to revolutionary purposes, to a popular front, to the communist states, quote, politicizing art. As in, let's say you wanted to make video essays on YouTube about obscure, if not esoteric, Marxist philosophers and video games. So what exactly is this totality that Lukács speaks of? For an unembellished definition, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy states, quote, with totality, Lukács refers to a whole set of elements that are meaningfully interrelated in such a way that the essence of each element can only be understood in its relation to the others. That is, we fail to grasp the real material social nature of things when we do not orient them within the context of larger systems in which they are found. A shipping container is simply a shipping container as long as it is found within a Call of Duty map, for example, that is itself delinked and decontextualized from a totality. A Dutch painting of a ship is also just that, a Dutch painting of a ship, as long as it too is disaggregated from the totality that, in actuality, produced it. This notion of totality presents challenges to any aesthetic or artistic claim to realism. For example, we can identify in Call of Duty maps some similar elements in the modernist literature so harshly criticized by Lukács. As Parker writes on Lukács, quote, the fragmentation of modernist form decadently and uncritically reproduced the alienated reification of modern life. He saw the modernists as writing for form and technique rather than for social representation, and he saw their form as a modernist stream of consciousness as swept up in merely individualist virtuosity. Most alarming, for Call of Duty, the appeal to realism, or what Lukács might have labeled pseudo-realism, naturalizes what would otherwise be a propagandistic treatment of militaristic chauvinism, wherein the implied and terroristic threats to freedom, interestingly enough, don't occur at home or abroad in some foreign land, but instead occur in discrete, decontextualized nodes along the supply chain. And this is the link between the base and superstructure. Totality is not simply a consideration within modes of realist representation, but, as Lukács stresses, it's an objective web of real relations. Consequently, just as it can be illuminating in works of realism, it can be equally liberating for solidarity between international working classes when there is a more robust consideration of totality. Whether it be Dutch maritime paintings or Call of Duty maps, we can begin to see connections between bourgeois modes of art and entertainment and the emphasis that those modes have on fragmentation and decontextualization, and the actual relations of production within capitalism, wherein the productive forces of the global economy have been increasingly fragmented, atomized, and rode roughshod over by the mandate and flexibility demanded by a post-Fordist economy. This today is our totality, defined, as Lukács pointed out correctly, by historical change, but nonetheless determined by the metastatic growth of a bourgeois world market. In his 1977-78 lectures entitled Security, Population, and Territory, Foucault speaks to what he observes as a fundamental shift in the way in which a territory is maintained and controlled. Around the 16th century, Foucault says, quote, "We see the emergence of a completely different problem that is no longer that of fixing and demarcating the territory, but of allowing circulations to take place, of controlling them, sifting the good and the bad, ensuring that things are always in movement, constantly moving around, continually going from one point to another, but in such a way that the inherent dangers of the circulation are cancelled out. No longer the safety of the prince and his territory, but the security of the population and, consequently, of those who govern it." That any politician today tries to capitalize on economic chauvinism, typically by using isolationist rhetoric, is not only anachronistic, because the global neoliberal economic order today is simply too dependent on global supply chains and cheap labor, but it's duplicitous. Just like the double standard when it comes to border walls, that is, porous for the circuits of capital, but impenetrable for refugees or migrants, for example, politicians, whether they be on either side of the aisle or any American president, usually directly benefit from the commodity flows, the offshore havens, and the foreign direct investments and financial speculation of global capitalism, yet turn around and spew nationalistic invectives in order to sow divisions in the various populations of the global working classes.
You're right.
Edna Bonicic and Jake Wilson put it well in their book, Getting the Goods, Ports, Labor, and the Logistics Revolution, when they write, quote, "The border serves as an important dividing line regarding the rights of workers, whereas capital and the governments that stand behind it is determined to eliminate border limitations to the free movement of capital. It has no intention of providing the same rights to labor. Capital is free to find the best deal it can anywhere in the world. Labor is afforded no such equivalent right. The result is the strengthening of the positions of capital in relation to labor." And yet political rhetoric is just one mechanism in this project to fragment and divide the working class and an international proletariat and a capitalism that is increasingly global. This fragmentation is very much a feature of neoliberalism and very much a response to the labor movement that threatened its ascendancy early on. With a globalizing world economy, capitalists increasingly could not risk having work stoppages or strikes threaten the unceasing movement of commodities. Fragmenting the working class was key in shoring up the viability of global supply chains and logistics. And notably, this practice became formalized and standardized as the economy shifted from a Fordist to a post-Fordist one. Henry Ford's adoption of the assembly line in automotive manufacturing revolutionized mass production. The push production of that era meant that manufacturers could consolidate more power on the supply side as retail inventories could continually be stocked. Moreover, the labor employed by those manufacturers enjoyed stronger unionization and the regulatory oversight that came with domestic manufacturing. But what about today? We obviously no longer live in an era of Fordism. Domestic manufacturing has largely dried up, leaving what were once thriving urban districts now blighted by disinvestment, the plant and the factory now supplanted by the big box retailer. Moreover, with the advent of neoliberalism, we saw earlier forms of job security replaced by new and increasingly precarious forms of labor if the jobs didn't disappear altogether. Relevant to this analysis, the post-Fordist age saw primarily a reversal of this asymmetry between manufacturing and retail. That is, the push economy became instead a pull economy. The neoliberal era became characterized by the seeking out of cheaper labor to exploit abroad, the outsourcing of jobs, and the race to the bottom as the bourgeoisie scoured the globe. This not only rewrote the geo-economic landscape, but maritime trade itself was forever altered. With domestic jobs outsourced overseas, suddenly retailers found themselves wielding all of the power once possessed by manufacturers. Instituting precarious contracted labor abroad, typically in deplorable working conditions, retailers found that they now had choice flexibility. Contracted manufacturers abroad could be dropped at a moment's notice for a cheaper price elsewhere. Insalubrious working conditions could be blamed on foreign manufacturing, not the company exploiting that labor. Foreign manufacturers could be pitted against one another. Plausible deniability came pre-installed. As the factories of domestic manufacturers left, in their place arose the big box retailers like Walmart, of whom has the largest logistics and private satellite systems, second only to the Pentagon. These companies, through their ability to unilaterally set international shipping rates and through technological developments like point-of-sale data and RFID, now wield all the power. Burns states that, quote, today's supply chains are distinguished not just by their planetary extension and incredible speed, but by their direct integration of manufacture and retail, their harmonization of the rhythms of production and consumption. A major contributing factor to a lot of these developments was deregulation, a significant tenet of the neoliberal agenda. From manufacturing to shipping and to dock work, the outsourced and contracted labor that is now foundational to much of the supply chain has only taken on more pernicious forms since deregulation. When we frame the discussion in terms of these geoeconomic developments, we can more clearly understand why sweatshops have taken on the form they have as a direct consequence of foreign direct investment and the over-reliance that so much of domestic retail has on cheap labor abroad. When large shippers like Walmart and Target have the capacity to pit foreign manufacturers against one another for the cheapest price, the logical consequence is of those foreign manufacturers cutting corners in order to still be profitable. And it goes without saying that some of the first corners to be cut are wages and investments in humane working conditions. Monachich and Wilson write that, quote, globalization became a partner of flexible production. This pattern has been associated with the rise of global sweatshops and what has been called the race to the bottom in terms of labor standards, as poor developing countries have vied for production contracts by promising foreign companies low-cost, compliant labor. The xenophobic rhetoric that blames third world countries themselves for these disastrous working conditions falls short precisely because it neglects to account for the systemic impact that Western capitalist countries have on and the unilateral power they wield against the global South. Second, the deregulation of shipping itself has resulted in some unique phenomena, none other than the system of flags of convenience, or FOC. FOC allows for a vessel that departs from one country to register as a vessel in another country. For example, on the purview of international law, it is permissible for a shipping company operating in the US to register its fleet or part of its fleet in Panama, a commonly held practice. This is not just permissible, but it's incentivized. For while the reason for certain registries can range from avoiding certain taxes or circumventing tariffs, it is undeniable that FOC immediately impacts labor, both the cost thereof and working conditions. That is, a vessel that may operate from a country with robust labor laws can instead register as a vessel in a country with abysmal labor laws, if not a complete lack thereof. Third and finally, deregulation has had the interesting and somewhat contradictory effect of demarcating geophysical space as exceptional to the law, while simultaneously enforcing more strict juridical legal apparatuses. This is no more evident than in the special economic zones that many international ports utilize. Within these heavily surveilled and securitized spaces, labor laws are suddenly suspended. Easterling describes these spaces as, quote, clandestine sites of labor abuse. And while SEZs attract shippers for a variety of reasons, their harshest outcomes fall disproportionately on labor. In the UAE, for instance, migrant laborers are quite literally confined to the securitized spaces of SEZs. They are denied both any protections from labor laws and citizenship. They are forbidden to enter the cities. These spaces become de facto labor camps if they don't actually materialize into overt labor camps. The irony is that deregulation instituted an entirely new and far more repressive regime of international laws and state control. As Bonasich and Wilson write, quote, just as neoliberalism at home did not mean a smaller or weaker state, but rather one in which coercive apparatuses flourished, as welfare offices emptied out, the prisons filled up, so has neoliberalism led to the enhancement of the coercive apparatus the imperial state needs to police social order around the world. There was, however, a single technological development that became the bearer of these new relations and ushered in the logistics revolution, the container. First deployed in Vietnam as a means to overcome the US's logistical nightmares, its inventor Malcolm McLean, a magnate of the shipping company Sealand, saw in the container commercial opportunities as well. From Vietnam, container ships were stopping in Japan to import cheap electronics to US Western ports. Intermodal shipping had been born. Containerization, then, was a child already born from the linked interests of US imperialism and commercial enterprise. Like Deborah Cohen reminds us of this era, quote, the revolution in logistics should not be interpreted as a civilianization of the field. If the art of logistics came to drive geopolitical military strategy and tactics in the early 20th century, today market models of economic space have increasingly come to drive the science of logistics across the blurring bounds of military and civilian domains. Thereafter, with the standardization of the 20-foot equivalent unit box, the days of break bulk shipping would vanish, and global capitalism would have the technological means to reconfigure the world. It would have the means, moreover, to finally make manifest a new theory of supply, one that would forever alter the world economy and have ramifications even for the present day. Bonasich and Wilson write that containerization, quote, made possible just-in-time production. It also greatly reduced the cost of ocean transportation, making it more cost-effective to produce at ever greater distances from the market. Part of the savings was found in the reduction of labor costs. The underlying issue with our supply chains today, and one of the reasons why they increasingly need to be shored up by the US military and state, resides within the operative logic and organization of the supply chain itself. Because it somehow always falls on the shoulders of automobile manufacturers to rewrite the economic playbook of production, it was Toyota's Ono Taiichi that, in the mid-20th century, ushered in a paradigmatic restructuring of production and supply. The Toyota system, or what we now call just-in-time supply, proselytized a new approach to manufacturing whereby only what is needed is produced, only when it is needed, and only in the amount needed. In part, however, these developments in Japan arose from the cross-pollination from U.S. economists who were tasked with resuscitating the Japanese economy during the U.S. occupation, and who continued to introduce new ideas in manufacturing throughout the Korean and Vietnam Wars. Toyota, albeit under the auspices of Western influence, still single-handedly restructured the class dynamic of Japan, later infecting the rest of the globe, into a split working class of highly skilled and well-paid laborers and a far larger subsection of precarious contractual laborers comprised of mostly women and immigrants who found themselves largely outside the purview of the imperial center. Though effective at reducing standing inventory in retail, the efficiency of just-in-time supply meant that manufacturers were contracted on an as-needed basis. This only further consolidated the power and influence of what were becoming the big box retailers. And so lean production was born. More broadly, developments like containerization and just-in-time supply, while heralding the logistics revolution, fragmented the labor movement and, as a global strategy that had a particular appeal during the Cold War, coerced communist countries into the web of trade and capital that inevitably led back to the capitalist countries of the global north. Of course, if you're a dialectical materialist, then you know that with the advent of this global economic paradigm, so too did it spawn its own contradictions. Just-in-time supply may afford retailers unprecedented flexibility, but without larger inventories, retailers cannot meet demand during times when the supply chain is hemorrhaging. Or any brief cessation or pause in the supply chain will have rippling consequences throughout its entirety, costing capitalists millions of dollars, sometimes by the hour. Suffice it to say that this newfound flexibility comes at a great cost. Most importantly, however, the productive forces of society, the labor, that is now globalized and fragmented by businesses that were once beleaguered by the agitations of domestic labor movements, now suddenly find themselves able to choke national and global supply chains and economies by making inoperable key ports and supply routes that, if they are to be profitable for the capitalist class, need to be in constant motion. With this new speed also came new frictions to undermine it. Work stoppages and strikes became the clotting agents in the arterial flow of capital, the lifeblood of that vampiric capitalist class hell-bent on maintaining the global circus of capital. Thus, imperial and state violence abroad and at home against those labeled terrorists or economic terrorists has been conjured to securitize these flows. As Lenin wrote, imperialism is the highest state of capitalism. Whether it's a Somali pirate or a striking dock worker on the West Coast, any threat to choke this flow is categorically a threat to homeland security. All this is to say that we should be more critical of media and media representations of the global character of capitalism and US empire. For Call of Duty, the overcompensation through realism, in addition to their fragmentation and their individualistic perspective, does more than just reify the conflation between political terrorism against the nation state and economic terrorism against the private property relations of late-stage capitalism, but also assiduously obscures the totality that is US imperialism, logistics, and global capitalism. Applying that appearance-essence dialectic of Lukács's, we can begin to understand how the pseudo-realism showcased in Call of Duty, pseudo precisely because of its emphasis on services, is a shield behind which it can defend its self-touted apoliticism.
Right. The question, is this a political game, doesn't actually mean anything, because it's what does the word political mean to you?
This game political?
No.
Really?
No.
Really?
We're just making games.
That seems insane.
It seems insane to get political to me.
As art and gameplay director of Infinity Ward Joe Emsley makes clear, by placing a premium on realism, the game obscures the totality, obscures the social relations of production. It is exactly what Lukács criticized expressionism, naturalism, and surrealism for, of working only on the, quote, level of immediacy. Realism is the cudgel with which the game developers exercise political content from the game, a crutch to stake out apoliticism. But much to the developers' chagrin, we can begin to see the political ramifications of Call of Duty when placed in Lukács' dialectic of appearance and essence. For while we can't deny the impressiveness of Call of Duty's verisimilitude, as a commodity, the game is incentivized to prioritize appearance over essence. Commodity fetish obscures social relations of production. Call of Duty's pseudo-realism obscures the totality. Furthermore, it seems as if first-person shooters, by virtue of the genre, lend themselves exceedingly well to do just this. Jamie Woodcock, in his book Marks at the Arcade, says this of FPS games, quote, "The appeal of FPS games also lies in the feedback loops and the facilitation of flow within the game environment. The player's focus is often on the game mechanics and immediate decisions being made. There is no clear transmission mechanism through which the values of the game pass to the player." Like the special economic zones it depicts, a Call of Duty map has a peculiar feel of an extra economic space, where the labor abuses by hyper-exploitative capitalism are concealed from the public, where labor laws are suspended and laborers themselves disappear, where the laws that govern that space convinces itself of its own myth of political exemption and geopolitical exception. To quote Khalili again, quote, "So much of the machinery of capital has been made inaccessible, invisible, hidden behind the veils of security and bureaucracy and distance. Maritime trade, logistics, and hydrocarbon transport are the clearest distillation of how global capitalism operates today. The maritime transport enterprise displays this tendency through its engineering of the lived environment, transforming natural features of the world into juridical ones, creating new spaces, structures, and infrastructures that aim at, though rarely achieve, frictionless accumulation and circulation of capital, creating fictive commodities, financial fetishes, and ever more innovative forms of speculation, and creating racialized hierarchies of labor." In contradistinction to this, a game like Michael Paneshi's Phone Story clearly glimpses something more towards Lukács' notion of totality. By positioning players in the role of a cell phone manufacturer, the game visits three ostensibly disparate locales: a Congolese coltan mine exploiting child labor, a Foxconn factory experiencing high rates of suicide amongst its workforce, a phone store somewhere in the global north, and a scrapyard in Ghana where people salvage parts from electronic waste. Though fragmented and self-enclosed, what unifies these maps is the commodity object of the phone and the different forms of human labor that constitute it, or extract new value from it, within global context. The totality is revealed via how the game maps the processes of global capitalism in its pursuit to manufacture this one commodity, in both its extractive and exploitative forms, and the consequences this has on the productive forces of different societies. The commodity of the phone is the through line, the production of which, in its embeddedness within regimes of outsourced labor, lean production, and just-in-time supply, inflect differently the different international working classes. As Lukács writes about realist literature, quote, "In the works of such writers, we observe the whole surface and all its essential determinants, and not just a subjective moment isolated from the totality in an abstract and over-intense manner." Especially for our age, an age defined by globalization, we can begin to map the connective tissue of a totality, logistics, supply chains, and maritime trade, components of which largely benefit us here in so-called developed countries. But as Lukács makes mention of, it is the crises that factor in totality that further reveal it. Consequently, this connective tissue can only be maintained by securitization, militarization, surveillance, and other forms of imperial violence that have become more prevalent in our global apartheid. Above all, new regimes of labor, increasingly more precarious, have emerged from the imperial responses to capitalism's global crises: the sweatshop, the outsourced contracted worker, the labor camp, and special economic zones. It's important to ask, who are our map makers in this age of neoliberal globalization and capitalist expansion? What do their maps say or evince about the mechanisms of capitalism? Do their treatments of these maps at all glimpse that totality that implicates all of us? Where are the productive forces of society positioned, if at all, within those maps? The laborers that maintain the scaffolding of that totality, without which it would all come crashing down. To conclude, I'll quote Alan Sakula from his photography book Fish Story. Quote, "I propose a more provisional funeral. If anything, the appropriate metaphor is found in Marx's notion of the dead labor embedded in commodities. If there is a single object that can be said to embody the disavowal implicit in the transnational bourgeoisie's fantasy of a world of wealth without workers, a world of uninhibited flows, it is this, the container, the very coffin of remote labor power. And like the table in Marx's explanation of commodity fetishism, the coffin has learned to dance.